So straight over to Mirjam Röder.
Okay, I will talk about how to reconcile food security and emissions in a changing climate. And our part of the project was to look in depth into climate change impacts on main food products, and my presentation will focus on wheat today. So the food systems are changing a triad of challenges. One is a rising global food demand due to population growth, changing lifestyles, and economic development. Another challenge is that we need to reduce our emissions. And actually, the food sector is associated with about 30% of the EU's emissions, and agriculture alone about 14%. So, and these emissions, as Alice already mentioned, are mainly from natural processes like nitrification or enteric fermentation, so they're much harder to control and to reduce. And the next challenge is that we need to adapt to climate impacts. And it is projected that in higher latitudes, agriculture will experience some benefits, like in yield improvements, but in lower latitudes, and Alice already mentioned it, we will face much worsening conditions like reduced yields, and these are actually also the regions with the highest food demand growth in the future. So there's a challenge that food supply, emission reduction, and adaptation are contradictory and not and often conflicting. So in our project, we looked at wheat and its emission under different impacts and production options. And this graph shows you the emissions occurring from producing 1 kilogram of wheat grain. So this is based on LCA's calculations. So this is a baseline, and the emissions from producing 1 kilogram of wheat grain in today's conditions and under average production conditions in the UK. And you can see from the graph that the main emissions are coming from the soil, and the other share part, a major share of the emissions are coming from the production of nitrogen fertilizer. And the less emissions are coming from agricultural activities and producing other inputs and transport and so on. So we assumed that within a 2-degree scenario, the UK's wheat production can increase yields during the next decades by about 25%. But this is under optimum production conditions without any interferences, so not including extreme weather events or any significant interruptions. So, and from this column, you can see that the emissions per kilogram of wheat grain are not very different from today's production. This is because the higher yields offset the higher inputs we need. But if you look at the total production, because we have higher yields, we produce more, also the total production, you can see from here, the emissions from total production actually increase. So now's the question, why should the UK increase production? Well, wheat production over here will be much more efficient than in other regions in the world. And it is more likely that the emission intensity of the UK production is lower. So there's a question of, should the UK take responsibility in supplying wheat for a global increasing demand? So we also assumed that in a 4-degree scenario, that we need even more inputs to still receive high yields. So you see that the emissions connected to nitrogen and soil are sharply increasing as we need much more inputs to receive these high yields. And if you look at the total emissions, these will even go up. So if the UK wants to receive, under the 4-degree scenario, appropriate yields, we have much higher emissions. We then, of course, also looked at how we can reduce emissions. And we assumed that nitrogen inhibitors are a very straightforward way to reduce emissions significantly. And this can you see here from these graphs. We looked at the baseline scenario and the 2-degree scenario. We didn't look at 4-degree scenarios because we don't even know how soil activities will be under higher temperatures and how organisms in the soil will react to higher temperatures. But in total, you can see that the emissions can be significantly reduced. But as I say, our calculation is based on optimal conditions, so no significant interference with the weather. So climate impacts can significantly threaten food security. And so regions benefiting from climate change, like the UK, need to increase productions to save or to support the global food security. But under a production-based approach, this actually means that the emissions in the UK will increase. A consumption-based approach would highlight how consumer and producer nations are linked and would show where are emissions produced and where are emissions consumed. So nonetheless, there's a need for strategies to reduce emissions, to minimize agricultural inputs, and to optimize land use. And from our scenarios in the report, you actually can see where emissions are lower, but you also can see, and Alice already mentioned it, how under more climate or severe climate change impacts, it is even harder to reduce these emissions. So our key messages from our work package are: there's a stride of challenges, a rising demand, a need to reduce emissions, and also to adapt to climate impacts. Global food security will in the future even more depend on countries benefiting from climate change or countries with less negative impacts. And decreasing production emissions is possible, but it is likely that producer countries will have increasing emissions. And a consumption-based approach would highlight how consumer and producer nations are linked. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirjam. So we now turn to the more sharply focused consumption part of the research. And while Carly's coming to the lectern, I just emphasise again the fact that the SCI is called the Sustainable Consumption Institute precisely because we want to highlight the role of consumption and consumers in the challenge of sustainability. And that's one of our differentiating features. And we've always taken very seriously in all of our projects, thinking in quite sophisticated and detailed ways about consumption behaviour and also interacting directly with consumers. And that's what Carly will now speak about in the context of this particular project and piece of work. Carly.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about consumer responses to some particular elements of the scenarios within the report. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we selected people for the focus groups that we ran and the sorts of topics we spoke with them about. Then go through some of the responses to these key elements of the scenarios before drawing some key messages. So in order to run these focus groups, we wanted to select high, middle and low carbon footprint groups, and we did that through using mosaic data, which could identify postcodes in the Greater Manchester area that were seen to be high, middle and low groups. And then in order to facilitate open discussion, we selected all male and all female groups from each of those categories. And we wanted to get people talking about food in, not just about sustainability, about food in general. So the first question was about what your favourite food is, getting people talking about food positively before moving on through to these more specific topics about sustainability and these future food issues. And those future food issues are drawn out of the scenarios in the report that you've got today. So we talked about seasonality, and by that we mean seasonal foods available in the UK. We talked about reducing meat consumption either by 20% or 70% as you get in Bubble and Squeak and Mash and Banger. We talked about lab meat and meal replacement tablets, these more sort of futuristic ideas around food. The role of communal eating, which comes out of Bubble and Squeak. And the role of GM from a mitigation or adaptation perspective in future food. So, a quick trot through what people thought about these different elements. So in terms of seasonality, there was a widespread confusion over seasonal products. What is a seasonal product? And more information requested on seasonal availability. There was also a desire, coupled with what ingredients you could have, a desire for what kind of recipes you could cook with those ingredients. And some parents queried the variety offered with seasonal products. So this kind of confusion is captured there in the first quote that I'd be hard pushed to know what was British and in season at any one point. I don't feel that I'm that educated enough to know what I'd be able to pick up. And that was a kind of common theme throughout the different groups. There's also an interesting element that some people were really disengaged with the idea of what seasonality was at all. And so we get that second quote there. I can sort of relate to that with Cadbury's cream eggs. They're semi-seasonal. They tried bringing them out for Halloween. It didn't really work because it was green. Cadbury's cream eggs, they're seasonal, and that's the only way I can relate back to you. You said that's how it used to be with seasonal food. That's the only seasonal food I know. It sounds stupid, it really does, but it genuinely is. And I don't put that quote up to be unkind. I mean, this is exemplifying how some people really talk about seasonality, that's the only kind of food that you cannot get at all times of the year for some of our participants. They spoke about Easter eggs and mince pies. When we asked them about food availability, those were the examples that they drawn. So it's not that everybody said that, but there were a few respondents that drew on these kinds of examples. So we then talked about meat consumption. And this discussion was really taking place in the context of people talking about the recession, rising food prices, fear about losing your job. And so when we talked about reducing meat consumption, a lot of people said that they were already trying to reduce meat consumption as food prices went up and they felt they were on a budget. But again, a lack of knowledge about meat-free recipes. So if you have meat-free Monday, what do you actually eat on a Monday? And a predicted reluctance by other family members. So all of our female groups spoke about the men in their households not being happy to have meals without meat in them. Our male groups, who were not related to the female groups, were quite open to reductions, particularly 20% reduction. 70% got much more of a reaction from people. So people were reflecting on the idea that we ate a lot more meat now and that perhaps this was turning because of pressures on price and budget. So we've got so much meat around and people have just got used to eating it all the time now. People saying that perhaps that was changing slightly. And then the second quote there, this idea about the male members of the family. My boyfriend's always a bit like, there's no meat, it's not a meal. So then in terms of lab meat, we introduced this very briefly and people had a kind of unprompted response of the potential animal welfare benefits. And again, that was across the groups. They also suggested ideas around it might be safer because it was more scientific and controlled, and that there could be health benefits and they should perhaps be promoted on these win-wins. They were very good at suggesting to us how we could sell in these ideas, so they thought these kind of win-win health benefits were a good idea. So here the first quote, nothing's dead because of it and we still get to eat meat, so I think it's the best of both worlds. And the second quote there, this idea about the sort of scientific nature of lab meat. If it tastes like meat, no problem. It's probably better than meat itself if they're growing it scientifically, to be perfectly honest. And through the kind of stakeholder engagement work that we've done with farmers, that kind of sentiment, potentially particularly worrying to them, the idea that something in a lab is safer than something that's reared on a farm. And you could get into that about the disconnect between where food comes from and all that sort of stuff. But I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm not going to. So communal eating. As we were a bit surprised with the unprompted benefits that people could see of lab meat, we were quite surprised at how much people hated the idea of communal eating. So it was very unpopular across the groups. Again, unprompted, people were talking about military canteens and slop and school dinners. Nothing positive, really, but many negative things came up unprompted. And many felt that it would aggravate existing social problems. So whilst we had suggested it as a way of kind of building social cohesion, people thought that actually kind of troublesome neighbours in the military canteen, it could all escalate. And it was seen as impractical and wasteful. So this was the only idea we suggested where people said, I'm not sure how it fits in with sustainability. I think it would be wasteful. Why would it be beneficial? We'd suggested it from an economies of scale point of view, but they questioned that. So these are some of the less colourful quotes people said about not liking it. I personally would probably be very reluctant. It would almost have to be forced upon us. I left shared housing behind when I was a student. I'm not going back to it. It's almost like a step back. Really uniformly disliked. Meal replacement tablets. Participants felt this wouldn't fit with family life, and the majority felt they would miss cooking and eating. They could see some role for it, as you see already in kind of weight management and diets and things like that. You already get these sorts of products. People had a familiarity there. And this was the point where people really spoke about the kind of social and cultural role of food and how embedded it is within their lives. And the following quote kind of captures that a lot of my day revolves around food, and it's a social thing as well. You meet with friends, you go out for a meal, you cook a meal, you sit down and you talk about your day, don't you? You're not going to sit there over a tablet, are you, saying, oh, this is what I've done today, darling, it's over, let's move on from that. So people not terribly keen on that one either. We then moved on to GM. There's a lot of confusion about whether we were or were not able to get GM products in the UK, again across the groups. And many questioned the safety of GM products. They knew that there were issues around GM. They weren't maybe quite sure what those were for a lot of participants. But there was also a sense that it was an inevitable part of the future. But it's worth saying that by this point, we've been talking about sustainability and environmental issues for some time, the idea of feeding a growing population. So it's not without previous context that they're then saying that this is an inevitable part of the future. And participants, again, requested more information on GM products. So the first quote there talks about its inevitability. I don't think we like the idea of GM food, but it's the way it's going to be. And the second then about this controversial nature, even if you yourself don't know that much about GM. I don't know enough about it. I've got no problem with GM food, but a lot of people do have problems with it, don't they? So there must be some issues. So a really complex area to get into that needs further work. So what were the key messages coming out of this? The high carbon footprint groups were the more engaged and interested in sustainability issues. Across all groups, participants call for more information, but we would really argue, based on all the kind of academic work around pro-environmental behaviour, that this information provision might be a necessary but not sufficient condition for behavioural change. So we're not in any way calling for a kind of educating people just into the right behaviour, and it's all very simple. People were saying they were confused about what the right thing to do is. And that's maybe different to other pro-environmental behaviours, perhaps around energy in the home, where people can recall quite easily what things they should be doing to combat climate change in their own home. Whereas people with food, we're talking about all these different goals, fair trade, reducing the carbon footprint, air miles. What's the right thing when you've got all these things competing? Participants were much less open to changes that impacted on the social and cultural role of eating, such as eating houses and meal replacement tablets. And they were more open to future changes that they could see having a kind of win-win, so if it saved them money or had animal welfare advantages. And in terms of achieving this kind of future food system, responsibility was framed differently. So for some people, they want more information, they want to be facilitated in making the right choice, however that's defined, and they wanted to be helped by government, producers and supermarkets. For others, they're much more removed from it than that. They're quite supportive of the idea of food being more sustainable, but they see the responsibility lying for that with somebody else to do it for them, and they can still continue to shop as they wish. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.